Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are joining us online this evening. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. Our bookstore will be selling copies of Jeff Nussbaum's new book if you are interested. Details and a link are in the description for tonight's program on our YouTube page. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore these important stories in American history with our distinguished guests this evening. I am now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. We're so glad to be welcoming Jeff Nussbaum to the Kennedy Library virtually. He has most recently served as a senior speechwriter for President Joe Biden. Previously, he was a partner at West Wing Writers, the premier strategy and speechwriting shop in Washington, D.C. He led or co-led speechwriting at the last 4 Democratic conventions. His new book is Undelivered, the Never Heard Speeches That Would Have Rewritten History. I'm also delighted to welcome to the library virtually our moderator for this evening. Mark Arsenault is a reporter for the Boston Globe, where he has covered casino development and gambling issues, national politics, and worked on Spotlight team investigations. He is also the author of The Imposter's War, The Press, Propaganda, and The Newsman Who Battled for the Minds of America. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Good evening. I'm Mark Arsenault from the Boston Globe. Thanks very much for being with us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you. And it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Jeff Nussbaum, who is the author of Undelivered. It's a fascinating book. It's a clever idea, Jeff. It's speeches prepared for delivery, but in fact, for one reason or another, not delivered. So why don't we start at the very beginning? Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so the genesis of this idea was election night 2000. I was the kid speechwriter for Al Gore, I'm not such a kid anymore. But on election night, I was left holding at one point 3 speeches that didn't get delivered. There was a victory, there was a concession, and then we thought that Vice President Gore might win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote. One of the ironies is that in this book, I don't have those speeches because I lost them at some point. So maybe the publication will bring them back out of the woodwork. But it set me on this quest to say, where are the other places in American national life, and in some cases other countries, where not just politics and not just elections, where the outcome was so in doubt that a different outcome had to be envisioned, and there was a draft prepared for it. So that's where it began, and I started finding them in all sorts of different places.
So how did you know in the beginning that so many undelivered speeches in fact existed? Like, where'd you even know where to look?
Yeah, it started as finding breadcrumbs. Like, I saw an article in the New York Times that in 1975, New York had come so close to bankruptcy that there was a speech prepared for Mayor Beam declaring the city bankrupt. And so I started following breadcrumbs wherever I could follow breadcrumbs. I talked to his press secretary at the time. He remembered seeing the speech, but he didn't have it. He sent me to a communications advisor. That guy also remembered seeing the speech, but he didn't have it. So he sent me to the young bankruptcy attorney, who at this point was an octogenarian, and said, you know, I have the bankruptcy filing. You can come by my office and take a look. And when I did, his assistant tapped me on the shoulder and said, I think I have what you're looking for, and withdrew the only known copy of Mayor Abe Beam declaring New York City bankrupt. So I started finding breadcrumbs. There was an article in an Australian magazine that Emperor Hirohito was so heartsick over his role in World War II that he had written a poem about it, but there may have also been a speech, and so the Library of Congress helped me track it down in Japanese, and I commissioned the translation. So each speech has its own story, and sometimes the breadcrumbs led to a brick wall.
Right.
But this became a little bit of an obsession, and while I'm not a journalist or a historian professionally, this book allowed me to put on those hats a little bit to recreate the moments, and then the speech in each chapter kind of serves as the capstone to say, here's what all that drama led up to, and here's what it didn't lead up to.
Right, right. So the first main speaker you present in the book is the late John Lewis, right, who I think in our more recent memories is a senior statesman in Congress, but in his youth, a civil rights leader selected to speak at the March on Washington, summer of 1963. I'm very interested in why you decided to start the book with Lewis, and in the same chapter, Martin Luther King Jr. Why begin with them?
I wanted to begin with them because that episode illustrates two things. One, that I had the experience of helping oversee the speech writing operations at several Democratic conventions. And I've always been interested in this tension between people who have their own agendas and their own brands, but who are now part of an event where they have to embrace a shared agenda. And the other thing is, John Lewis, near the end of his life, we revered him rightly as a civil rights hero, but in all the remembrance of him, a lot of the rough edges got sanded off. Mm-hmm. And we forget that he was a young firebrand. He was leading SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was kind of the youth movement of the civil rights movement. And he was very clear when he was invited to speak at the March on Washington. He initially didn't want to speak. He felt like that march had become sanitized. It was becoming, in his words, a march in Washington, not a march on Washington. And so he said, one of the quotes we have in the book is, if I was going to speak there, I wanted to put some sting into it. Mm-hmm. And so he was determined to put some sting into it. And the first draft of his speech had a lot of sting.
Let me start you there. Yeah. So all right. So set the scene and the stakes for John Lewis at this time. Give us a bit of a warm up for that.
Yeah. So here comes the 1963 March on Washington. Again, it's actually quite an establishment event, except that the city of Washington was on high alert. They canceled baseball games. They deputized the police officers from Virginia and Maryland. I mean, the city was an armed camp. And yet, President Kennedy had this tenuous relationship with the march. And what allowed him to embrace it a little more was that the Catholic Church embraced it, the Cardinal was going to give the invocation, the labor unions had embraced it. And so here comes John Lewis, who has been in the fight. He's been arrested something like 20 times leading up to this. He's been on the Freedom Rides, the bus he was on, he was off it for a little bit, but had been firebombed. He had really seen the worst of the resistance to the civil rights movement. And he wants to share that. And I say at one point, if King wanted to tell people about the dream, although initially King didn't want to tell people about the dream, John Lewis certainly wanted to tell people about the nightmare.
Right.
And so one of his advisors sees the night before the march that copies of the different people's speeches are being put out for the press and thinks, I should put out John Lewis's draft. And this, all hell breaks loose.
Okay. Because
they see some of the language that's in there. Of particular offense to the Catholic Church and the Cardinal is that he says patience is a dirty and nasty word. He says we can't support Kennedy's civil rights bill because it's too little and too late. He says we want to march through Georgia the way Sherman did and burn segregation to the ground. So this is
provocative
stuff.
Yeah, right.
Provocative stuff. And so now the organizers, who are kind of the graybeards of the march, basically say to Lewis, you got to tone it down.
Yeah, I'm interested about this, the external and sort of internal pressures felt by John Lewis at that time. So what are the pressures pushing on him and in his own mind pushing back?
So he's pushing back because he has sort of, and there's this wonderful scene, and in the archives I found a photo that's in the book, and it's John Lewis has retreated underneath the arm of Abraham Lincoln at the back of the Lincoln Memorial to work on his speech. And the reason he does that. Initially, he's kind of behind the Lincoln Memorial. The march has started. There's music, there's musicians. And King, who affectionately called John Lewis the boy from Troy, says, "John, this doesn't sound like you." And Lewis replies, "Yeah, but it sounds like us." So his pressure was, I have to speak for SNCC. I'm the new head of it. I need to be the voice of this young group. And what happens then is no one can get him to change much. He's willing to take out the patience line, like he's willing to throw that one overboard. But he's not so willing to throw much of the other stuff overboard. And now he kind of is flanked by Jim Foreman and Cortland Cox, who are both his advisors and kind of his defenders. And King sort of gives up. I can't get him to change his mind. And finally, A. Philip Randolph comes to him and basically says, "John," and this is a quote, "I've waited 22 years for this. I've waited all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it." And then Lewis recounts later, "If I said no at that point, it'd be like saying no to Mother Teresa." And so he says, "I'll fix it," and retreats behind the Lincoln Memorial and hedges in a lot of different places. So, we can't support the Civil Rights Bill becomes, in its present form, we can't support the Civil Rights Bill. Okay. Here's what it won't do. So he hedges and hedges, and he feels like he's compromising himself.
He softened some pretty barbed language, right?
Yeah, and in the book we've got this great visual of what he wanted to say and what he actually said, and here's the bold of what went in, and here's the italics of what went out.
So immediately after this, what did he think about did he feel like a sellout? What did he feel like?
He wasn't happy. Yeah. But what he didn't realize, and this is something I often say to people who I work with, is people don't hear what you wanted to say. They hear how you say what you did say. And in truth, what he did say struck a chord. It was the fieriest speech of the day. And it actually served as a nice counterpoint. He started speaking, the march, and basically told people about the nightmare. And then King offers the coda telling them about the dream. And it's funny, when John Lewis was introduced, he was introduced as young John Lewis. And so you think like maybe they were a little worried about what he might say. Like even in introducing him, they were sort of putting a little distance between him and the rest of the march.
Right. So later on, did Lewis come to see these edits as a good thing?
He did. He basically said, I'm glad I edited because the message still got through.
Right. So again, what I like about not just this story, but the whole book is the idea that it's not that big a jump to think there could have been a different outcome, right? There's an entire realm of science fiction about alternate history, right? And I think your book does the best job showing how fine the line is. We could have a different timeline if just some people had made some different choices. If John Lewis had gone rogue and went up there at the microphone, no one's going to stop him at that point, and had given the original speech, what might have been the effect?
Yeah, I think about this as because John Lewis didn't quite get to give the speech he wanted to give, neither did King give the speech his advisors wanted him to give.
Right.
They wanted him to give a speech that they had called Normalcy Never Again. And I believe that was actually still the official name of the I Have a Dream speech.
Right.
But gone was a lot of the language that they wanted, which basically said, people are saying we can make some civil rights progress once we return to normalcy. I want to be clear with you, there will be normalcy never again in this country. So you can see a universe, and it's not too much of a stretch, in which Lewis is fiery. King is basically saying, all this scary stuff to you Southern whites ain't going to stop. And all of a sudden, Kennedy doesn't invite them to the White House after the march, doesn't embrace the march. And something, progress stalls on the Civil Rights Bill. Kennedy's a little less forceful about it.
Right.
And so, it's probably a stretch to say it would have entirely rewritten history, but it would be remembered much differently.
Right. Thanks, great. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about craft.
Yeah.
Right? Now and you go through this in the book, in many places you talk about the craft of writing speeches, and there are distinct techniques commonly used. You describe in the book many terms of art and craft, right? For instance, litany, right? A series of repetitive sentences that can be really effective because of the way they land on the ear. So there are other well-tested building blocks of a good speech. And my question is, In what way is speech writing a technical science, and in what way is it an art?
Yeah, there's the joke, I think it might be a Seinfeld joke, that more people fear death than public speaking, which is to say you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. And I think that's because people sometimes see speech making and speech writing as an almost unapproachable art, but the truth is it is a craft.
Yeah.
And as you say, in each chapter I offer a little bit of a digression on what element of the craft are we seeing here. As we pull back the curtain a little bit, yes, it's a historical moment, but what else is the craft? And you mentioned litany, for example. There are a couple points I'd make. One is human brains are amazing pattern recognizers.
Mm-hmm.
And when you understand what litany is, which is basically a series of repeated words or phrases, you see them throughout so many key documents and key speeches in American history. The Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Particulars against King George, it's he has, something like 22 times, 24 times. And this is because speeches aren't essays. They're sheet music. And you want the audience to feel the rhythm. And once an audience feels the rhythm, they do something else that persuasive speeches need the audience to do, which is they start marching. Mm-hmm. And there's a quote in the book when Pericles speaks, people say how well he speaks. When Demosthenes, or a friend told me it's actually pronounced Demosthenes, when Demosthenes speaks, the people say, "Let us march." So how well he speaks versus "let us march," I think most leaders would say, I choose the "let us march." Right. I want to get people marching. And so litany is one example of that. And there's subgenres of litany.
Right.
Anaphora, epistrophe, whether the repeated phrase is at the beginning or the end of the sentence.
Right. So this is science.
This
part is science, right? So art marries onto that, though.
Exactly. And science and craft, that you can start to insert these things in a speech and see what you're writing take on a slightly different tenor. And the other is story. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I often say is we like to think that we are thinking animals with feelings, but we're feeling animals who occasionally think. And so that's one of the takeaways, and not to undercut my craft, but people don't really remember what you say to them, but they do remember how it made them feel. Right. And story is one of the most powerful ways to evoke feeling.
Right, that's great. So I want to talk about another great character in the book that really hits home for us in Boston, and that's former Mayor Kevin White, right? Now the book, you drop us into 1974, amid the busing crisis. It is one of the most tumultuous eras in Boston history. I think certainly most people around here know the general story, but right. We've got a lot of people watching from a lot of different corners of the world. So catch us up on the scene, sketch that scene out from Mayor White's perspective. What was he facing?
Yeah, so Mayor White was a progressive mayor. He was really a star and a rising star in Democratic politics. He was thought to be a potential vice presidential pick. He was, as I said, progressive, but he was confronted with something in Boston in the 70s, in 1974, where basically Judge Garrity, a judge who lived in Wellesley, which White mentioned many times, mm-hmm. made a decision about integrating Boston schools. And what had to happen is there was a plan put in place where basically if you take the communities of Boston that needed to be integrated, they would sort of be linked one to another to kind of integrate. But then this left the two poles, South Boston and Roxbury. Mm-hmm. And the plan called for students to be bused from Roxbury to South Boston and South Boston to Roxbury to integrate the schools. And this was not well received, particularly in South Boston. And as these students are being bused, you get the most dramatic scenes, and I'm sure some people watching remember this, of in South Boston, people throwing bricks through the windows of buses, people chanting horrible things, throwing bananas at these kids going to school, and violence. A lot of the police trying to protect the students in South Boston were from South Boston. They were being called traitors. One of them died of a heart attack. It was terrible. And Kevin White, we have a scene here in the book where Kevin White, before the first full week of busing, shows up at State Senator Billy Bulger's house and asks for help, which he doesn't get. But then he says, tell your brother Whitey Bulger not to keep messing with things, because John F. Kennedy's childhood home had been firebombed. People thought the Mullins gang and Bulger's gang were basically going to start shooting people. So it was really precarious. And White basically had a moment where he believed in integration. He really wanted to do this, but he did not like the way the judge was doing it. He did not like it ordered from on high.
Right.
And he basically had a moment where he said, I'm not doing this. And there's this moment where he basically says, could have become a Northern George Wallace, standing in the schoolhouse door, and he prepared a State of the City speech where he was going to say, I'm going to shut down South Boston High, and I'm going to have the city support the most reactionary elements among the parent group, and support them in trying to appeal this case. And ultimately, he decided against it.
Right. So how do you think that might have played out differently if he had decided to fight, to appeal?
Yeah, and the draft you see of the State of the City speech, and I included in the book, is really, sometimes a draft is an act of catharsis. And I think this really was an act of catharsis. I mean, he talks about the judge sitting in his fancy suburb of Wellesley.
Right, which we should say is a very exclusive and fancy, affluent suburb of Boston.
Exactly, right. And there had been an earlier Supreme Court decision that basically kept the suburbs out of the integration equation. And I grew up a little later in one of these similarly fancy suburbs, and there were programs like METGO program, which was here in Boston, which helped integrate the schools a little, but it was really the suburbs not quite fully doing their part, leaving Boston's problems to Boston. So he basically makes a calculation that if he had done it, it would have been wildly popular. By some estimates, 80% of the residents of Boston were against busing. And in its form, White was against busing.
Yeah.
And by the way, White is the author of one of the great political lines, one of President Biden's famous lines is, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And so, so what was the alternative? But remember, in the context, Nixon had just stepped down, and White basically says, proving that we need to be a nation of laws.
Right.
And he ultimately makes a decision that if I fight this, not only will I be on the wrong side of history, but I may not be successful. And so there's something worse than being with the people, which is being with the people, but impotent and being wrong. And he didn't want to be either of those things. And he has this great quote that he ultimately delivered in his State of the City address. Quote, "There's no odor save death, worse than that of a public official, too frightened and fearful to say above a whisper what he honestly believes." And so he laid it all out there. He said, it's not popular, but it's the law, and we're going to follow it, and you're going to suck it up. And he said this, and he ran for re-election, and he won. And so I find this chapter in history and this chapter of Kevin White an opportunity to sort of reclaim someone who's been a little bit lost to history, who was actually a tremendously brave, articulate leader, and a reminder of what it means to be a nation of laws.
Yeah, we should say that there is now a larger-than-life statue of Kevin White across the street from City Hall.
Yeah, and you think about, people who were players in this, who were not quite on the right side of history, became, Ray Flynn, Billy Bulger. They sort of redeemed themselves over time and changed. But one of my favorite little facts is that the school board didn't really start to change until it elected its first two members of color. And the two members of color, the first elected, their last names were O'Brien and McGuire. So we wonder how many South Bostonians voted for O'Brien and McGuire, thinking that they were electing people who looked just like them.
Yeah, a couple of good Irish folks.
Yeah.
So let's zoom back out again, and let's learn more about craft. I find this really fascinating. All right, let's say you are writing a speech for Joe Biden, right? So what does the interplay look like between the two of you from the moment you get the assignment? What happens after that?
Yeah, and I should be clear, I have known President Biden for a while and worked with him quite a bit. I was not his chief speechwriter. There's a team.
Right.
But you get the assignment, and one of the things I say in writing for President Biden, who I admire tremendously, and we can talk a little bit more about him and how I came to know him, but But basically, I describe it as like being a session musician in a band that's already released 20 albums.
Okay.
Joe Biden has 3-4 decades of history on almost every topic. And so it starts with a couple tracks. One is, what is the speech about and where is it? And when has he been there before? And who does he know in the crowd? And these are the things, the questions you go through, or you should go through on any speech, which are, and Aristotle would say this is ethos, this is characterization. Basically, he needs to walk into a room and show the people there that he gets them. I know who you are, I've been here before, I get what's important to you. So part of it is going down the ethos path, helping him reconnect with this audience, knowing who the crowd is. Part of it is, if we're doing logos, pathos, and ethos, what's the logic path? You go to the policy people. What's the policy we're talking about? How are we gonna translate this governmentalese, you know, the refundable child tax credit? Okay, but what does that mean in your life if you're a family making X amount of dollars? And then finally, there's the emotion side, which is where does the emotion come from? And the emotion doesn't come from the policy. It comes from how it's going to impact people's lives. And so one of the things I would always do, working for President Biden, is I'd go to the correspondence office and I'd say, give me all the letters that people wrote about this issue. Or, you know, talk to someone in the town where we're going. You know, what's the story here? And so you're really trying to understand the president's history on these issues, connect the values, right? Circumstances change, but his values haven't, and give him a way to connect with the audience across all these several levels. And then you write the speech, and the thing that's different writing for a president from writing for a vice president or a CEO or a foundation head is the level of scrutiny is pretty intense.
Okay.
The legal department makes sure you're not violating any laws. The
Libeling
research,
anybody?
yeah, the research department makes sure, and they're all wonderful, and we loved working with them. You know, the research department fact checks you, and the policy department looks at this, and the communications department looks at that. But ultimately, the president looks at them, and the president cares deeply about speeches, and so he looked, you know, he either offered input on the front end, or we would do a session the day before where he would go through it and say, no, this doesn't work. I need to be clear about what story we're telling here. And so he really made it his every time. Sometimes it started with him, sometimes on smaller stuff he would weigh in a day or two in advance. But he had to hear it and see it and edit it before he delivered it, and I found that tremendously admirable. He really wanted to use the Lockean expression, mix his labor with it before he owned it.
Right, terrific. All right, so I want to touch on one undelivered speech you mentioned in the book that probably the only one I actually had heard of before. That's sort of famous in its own right, and that is the note by General Eisenhower, taking 100% of the responsibility if the D-Day landings turned out to be a disaster.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I love this story.
So he wrote, right, that he wrote before the invasion, any blame for failure is, quote, mine alone. Right, so thankfully, he didn't have to give that speech, but he was ready to, which is what I think makes it so remarkable. I wonder if you could just set that up a bit, and then if you have it, maybe it's just very short, maybe even share it with us.
Sure, absolutely. So we're getting ready for the D-Day invasion, and a lot, for the military history buffs in the audience, a lot depended on the weather, and he was constantly getting weather reports, and he was very informed by what had happened at Dunkirk. He was concerned that we would succeed in getting the troops onto the beach, and then they would be stranded there. And so he had a very fraught decision to make, a go, no-go decision. And one of the things he did before almost every engagement in action that he ordered is he wrote a short note apologizing for it and accepting accountability. And then the invasion or the action in battle would proceed, and he would rip it up and forget about it. In this case, he writes this speech in haste. He misdates it because he's moving so quickly. But you point out the responsibility he takes. And in fact, one of the things we see in the draft in his own hand is he crosses out the line where he had written the troops have been withdrawn, and changes it to "I have withdrawn the troops."
Makes it more active. He takes it out of passive voice.
Exactly, and right, for the grammarians, like, it was passive voice, it's now active voice, right? It's the mistakes were made,
right?
You know, or right, the passive version of "why did the chicken cross the road" was, you know, why was the road crossed by the chicken?
Right.
And we see him take full responsibility, and it reminded me of something that I also found in this chapter, where President Grant once said to his physician, "I am a verb. I am a verb." And I love that because its leaders are action takers.
Right.
And later in an interview, Eisenhower said, there was no hiding from this. This was my decision. I had planned it. If it failed, it was going to be on me. And the manful thing to do would be to take responsibility. And so the invasion proceeds. It goes as well as can possibly be expected, although we forget that the scale of this invasion was so massive that, you know, thousands of troops did die, and we don't want to forget that. But as an invasion, it was successful. And he sort of forgets about the note and keeps it folded in his wallet. And several weeks or several months later, it depends on which source you trust, he finds it and tosses it in the trash can. He can finally rest easy that the invasion has been a success. His aide fishes it out of the trash and says, "This one is probably worth keeping." And so its existence is known, but rediscovering it and rediscovering how he used language was really fun for me.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and I'm interested if you can think of a recent example where a public figure so thoroughly accepted blame for failure.
I mean, I'm sure given enough time I can think of something, but one of the things I talk about in the book, and by the way, Grant, who said "I am a verb," is also the president who's credited with the first use of the expression "mistakes are made," which is like the quintessential not passive and taking blame. Right. But in fact, apology, you know, fulsome apology has really fallen out of favor. And in fact, there's some evidence, disappointingly, that apology is actually the wrong thing to do in most cases. That apology basically demoralizes your supporters and emboldens your detractors. And there's a little bit of evidence behind this. And I worry that that's the message a lot of leaders are getting today, which is, why don't I stay defiant? My supporters are rallying to me. My detractors don't like me anyway. And if I just stay defiant and weather this, I won't have to apologize at all.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is there any upside for taking full responsibility for failure now? If you're in politics, it may be somewhat different in civic life, but is there an upside, or are you just handing your opponent something to hit you with?
I would like to think there is a moral upside. You know, moral victory, right? Like, you know, I used to work for James Carville, the political consultant, you know, who'd say, like, you know what you call moral victory? A loss, you know? But I would like to think that we live in a world where facts matter and responsibility is a virtue, and leadership is something to be demonstrated, because ultimately, even if you're not going to have to answer to your supporters or the voters, you ultimately have to answer to yourself or whatever higher power you believe in. So I do worry that apology is fallen out of favor, and you don't see much of it, and yet I think it has its virtues.
Right. Okay. So I want to move on to what I think is the most terrifying undelivered speech in the book, and that is the one prepared for President John F. Kennedy in 1962. To be delivered if or when the United States launched military strikes on Soviet missile launches in Cuba. So I think we can imagine the consequences for the world if that, in fact, had been the speech Kennedy had delivered. So describe for us that particular piece of writing and what strikes you about it.
Yeah, so this is a harrowing one, and the stakes were probably higher for this undelivered speech than any other. So the president is informed that by his national security advisor, by McGeorge Bundy, that we have images of missile sites in Cuba, Soviet missiles being built. And very quickly, his military advisors want to have a massive airstrike, 800 sorties, take all this stuff out. Kennedy's not entirely comfortable with this and creates the executive committee of his National Security Council, and Robert Kennedy kind of takes over and divides them into two groups and says, okay, airstrikes is one option, a naval blockade is the other option. These relatively quickly become clear that these are the two options. But a blockade tells the Soviets what we know. And so if you do the blockade, you can't do the airstrikes.
Because it's not a surprise attack.
Because it's not a surprise attack. And one of the things RFK did was said, when the president gets back from this campaign swing, we're going to present our recommendations to him, and each group needs to preface its recommendations with a speech. And I just love this as an exercise, because if we're going to take this course of action, a big part of deciding the course of action is, can we explain to the American people why we are taking this course of action? And by the way, these two groups, when it was later reported on, kind of the drama that took place, is the first use in print of the terms hawks and doves. So these became the war hawks and the Picasso doves. So we have this airstrike speech, and in it there is a parenthetical that says, and when journalists write a story and they're looking for a piece of information they don't have, they say TK to come. As you know from your...
That is what you do.
Did I get it right? Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. And there's a fun story because of why it's TK and not TC. But anyway, so speechwriters have a similar thing. There's a bracketed parenthetical, and this parenthetical says, follows a description of first reports of action. And I tell the story that one of my colleagues once told me is Jimmy Carter had this story that said, on a tombstone, there's the day you're born and the day you die, and there's a tiny dash between the two, and to God, that dash is everything. Well, I say to humanity, this parenthetical is everything.
Yes.
Because the first action, what we didn't know then, but we knew years later, was that many of these missiles were already operational, and command had been handed to the battery commanders. They didn't have to call the Soviet Union to fire a nuclear missile. And so the airstrikes really could have launched us into a nuclear war, nuclear annihilation, if not of the entire eastern seaboard, the base at Guantanamo.
Yep.
It really could have gotten ugly. And there's another bit of drama. The drama within the drama is, after the fact, anyone who was involved in writing the airstrike speech basically denied having written it.
Yeah.
And so I spent some time trying to figure out who wrote it.
That's what I found that really interesting. You did a lot of investigation to try to figure out who wrote it. What did you learn?
Yeah, so this is my rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, because in the grand scheme of things, who wrote it is not the most important thing. The fact that it didn't get delivered is the most important thing. But McGeorge Bundy, who was a talented writer in his own right, basically never mentions this speech again, even though he was leading the airstrike group. Ted Sorensen, who was a close advisor to Kennedy and basically a policy advisor and a poet and an alter ego of sorts, also vociferously denied writing it. So I actually commissioned an FBI forensic analyst to look at the handwriting on the speech, or the edits, and those were Bundy's. So we know Bundy had a hand in it. And we know that the speeches are relatively similar. But later, I found a couple of clues that Sorensen may have had more of a hand in it than he was willing to acknowledge. There were phrases that only Sorensen used, that only appeared in Kennedy's speeches once Sorensen arrived on the scene. And there was an archived interview that had never aired for a Cold War documentary series, where Sorensen goes further in saying, yeah, I kind of went down the path of drafting it, and then I found it so abhorrent. So it's possible he drafted most of it and basically put it on the table, and someone took the rest of it and ran with it. But it was kind of interesting, because I kind of went into my own experience, which was not as heightened as this, to look and say, okay, I've written a couple speeches that I found really morally challenging to write.
This is what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
How do you handle that as a speechwriter? Sorensen had to do it, you've had to do it, when you just disagree to your core with what your boss wants to say.
So two comments on that. So one is, in the case of the Iraq War resolution, I had to write a speech in favor of it.
And you were working for Tom Daschle.
I was working for Tom Daschle, who is just an absolute prince of a guy and a wonderful senator, and has been an amazing career mentor to me. And he wasn't sure where he wanted to go, and ultimately he supported the resolution. And we can go deep down a political hole of whether the Bush administration misused that resolution. But anyway, I wrote the speech. I can picture exactly where I was. I remember trying to figure out how to use track changes, But I went back and looked at the speech, and if you showed it to me now with no context, I'd say, I didn't write that. I've never seen it.
And Robert Kennedy talks about something similar happening in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that basically we were under so much pressure, we were so exhausted, that it started to play tricks on us. So I believe Sorensen can absolutely say, never saw it, never wrote it,
Right.
and may have written it. When we're not talking about issues of war and peace and nuclear annihilation, again, I mentioned James Carville, who I'd worked with. He basically said to me, look, and this goes to writing speeches that you don't always agree with. He said, do you want to write a speech for someone you agree with 85% of the time who can get 51% of the vote? Or do you want to write a speech for someone you agree with 100% of the time and they can go stand on a soapbox somewhere and shout it into the wind because they can only get 49% of the vote? And it's an unidealistic lesson, but it's actually an important lesson if we want to make our politics work, which is,
Right.
yeah, there's going to be sacred ground. There always will be. But we got to make a little bit more of an effort to find common ground.
Right, right. Okay, thank you. So I think we should talk about the other mention of JFK in the book.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the speech he planned to deliver in Dallas when he was shot.
Right.
And so who was he planning to talk to, and what did he intend to say?
Yeah, so I'll start by dialing out a little bit because most of these speeches in the book are events where there was one of two outcomes, sort of two outcomes or more outcomes were being envisioned. But the last chapter of the book I call Last Words, and it's speeches that 4 different leaders were working on when they died. And in each case, they didn't know death was imminent, so those speeches take on an added poignancy. And I have FDR, who was working on a speech envisioning the end of World War II, basically saying, what do we need to do to not just end this war, but to end the beginnings of all wars? Pope Pius was working on a speech where he was getting ready to disavow Mussolini and fascism, and he died before he could give it. Albert Einstein was working on a speech on Israel Independence Day. And all of these speeches have kind of a theme of a little bit of peace and what is required to live in harmony. And so this brings us to Kennedy, who was going to speak in Dallas to basically a group made up of a couple of different groups, a citizens council, a school. And when I did this chapter, and another chapter about Condoleeza Rice, the speech she was going to give on September 11th, I basically asked for all the materials surrounding the speech.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get those materials, they're very clear to anyone who writes speeches for a living what they're trying to do. You see, for the Dallas speech, it's economic progress in Texas, oil and gas leases, a collection of Texas humor. You see all the ingredients. But this speech, which was kind of a campaign kickoff, he needed to win. He needed to compete in Texas because even though Kennedy was immensely popular at the beginning of the year, his popularity was sort of plummeting,
Okay.
in part over civil rights. And Texas, hard to think of now, was kind of his blue wall. And so he was going to contest Texas. But here in his final speech, Undelivered speech, he wasn't really giving a political speech. In these audiences, he basically said, I'm going to find a theme that kind of unites the audiences I'm talking to. And he talked about the link between learning and leadership. And to the extent the speech is remembered now, it's remembered as a foreign policy speech. We're the watchmen on the wall of world freedom. And it is a foreign policy speech. But what's less remembered is that he was also very clear that if you're going to be the watchman on the wall for freedom, you got to look out, but you also have to look in. And he was really concerned about incendiary forces here at home that will feel very familiar to all of us today. There was a guy named Edwin Walker, who was a former World War II general, who had helped foment riots at the University of Mississippi when the school attempted to integrate. He declared that civil rights demonstrations in Washington, Texas, and I'll read some of this, were pro-Kennedy, pro-communist, and pro-socialist. He accused Kennedy of being lax on communism and of, quote, appointing anti-Christians to federal office, right? So this all sounds very familiar. And Kennedy basically said, even as he's talking about foreign policy, he was prepared to say in the speech, today there are other voices heard in the land, voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality. And he basically then says, ignorance and misinformation can handicap the progress of a city or a company, but they can, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicap this country's security.
It's like he's just came back from a time machine, right? I mean, it's,
exactly.
It's like speaking to us today.
Yeah, and I found this in a bunch of different places where if we had heard those warnings at the time, would we maybe need to heed them less today?
Yeah.
Governor Algeld, another chapter at the end of the 1800s, had pardoned the Haymarket prisoners, and this set loose a wave of anti-immigrant fervor. We can get there.
So who were these folks?
Okay,
set that scene for us.
So some of us may remember vaguely from history that there was a bombing at a labor rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square, and several people died, including several police officers. There was a rush to justice, a rush to judgment, but not to justice, where a bunch of prominent anarchists were rounded up, imprisoned. A couple sentenced to death, a couple died in prison, and a couple were still alive when John Algeld becomes governor. And Algeld's a really interesting character. He had been born in Germany. He made a lot of money in real estate, and so was kind of an early self-funder and very progressive. He had written a book about the prison system and how it wasn't working, and he was befriended by a young Clarence Darrow, who was advocating for him to pardon the prisoners. He'd gotten malaria in the Civil War, so he was in bad health most of his life, but he becomes governor, and it's not the first thing he does, but he basically orders a full review of the case and determines that it's been a terrible miscarriage of justice and pardons the prisoners. And one of the interesting sidelights is there was a man who wanted to deliver the pardon to the prisoners, the surviving prisoners, and let them know they were free. It was one of the jurors on the original jury that convicted them, who was so heartsick that he had participated in this miscarriage of justice that he wanted to be the one to give them their freedom. So Algeld knew this was going to unleash hell on him, and it did. And he was basically drummed from office. And newspapers that we now think of reputable said terrible things about him. He wouldn't have done this if he had a drop of American blood. He's as good as the anarchists that he's releasing. And he loses re-election. And typically, the losing party would get to give a farewell address. The person who was elected governor basically says, we've had enough of this anarchist. We don't need to hear from him anymore. And Algeld had a folded speech in his pocket he was ready to give at this transfer of power, and he just wasn't invited up to the podium. And when you look at that speech today, he basically lays out the responsibilities of political parties. He basically says, okay, if you're the losing party, you got to go back to the wilderness and recalibrate and find the ideas that are going to bring you back to power. And if you're the winning party, it's now time to govern. And if that requires compromising some of the ideas that brought you to power, that's what you got to do. And it's just all of this, right? The saying is history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. We think of Kennedy warning about domestic extremism, Algeld warning about partisanship. All of it feels really relevant to us today, eerily so. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which also was the first usage of the term eyeball to eyeball. Well, we're eyeball to eyeball with Russia right now. And so all of it feels very relevant and informative.
Yeah. Do you think if nothing out of the ordinary had happened in Dallas on that trip, that speech that he would have delivered would have been remembered today?
That's a really great question, and I think about this a lot, because there's a line in the speech where he says, we cannot expect everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense. Now, I can't go back to the 60s and say, like, is that a line where the president basically tells Americans to stop listening to nonsense that would cause people to sit up and listen? But I do think a kind of strongly voiced voice from the president basically taking down Edwin Walker and his ilk may have caused people to sit up and say, you know what, like, we do need to pay attention to the facts. Facts do matter. And if we go down these these paths of listening to nonsense, the argument Kennedy was really making is, you're not just indulging yourself, you're weakening America. And so maybe people would have listened. I hope.
Yeah. Are there instances in your book, I mean, not all of these were choices. Some of these speeches were not delivered, and that was not really out of choice. But are there instances that you can think of where maybe the person, the speaker, or the nation would actually have been better off if they had delivered the undelivered speech?
That's a great question. They're not. One of my friends tweeted out. So in this book, we have Hillary Clinton's 2016 victory speech. Yeah. And one of my friends tweeted out, like, come take a path down a better timeline. And I kind of said to her, like, okay, like Hillary Clinton's 2016 victory speech for many people, and I would guess many people watching, feels like a better timeline. And then I said, but almost every other speech in the book, like, was a worse timeline. So the Hillary speech, for certain, laid out a very different reality than the one we are even still living through. But there were some that actually were better for not having been heard. Another Massachusetts one, and we heard in the introduction the discussion about the fact that we are on native land. Yeah. So we have in the book the speech at the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims Landing, where the leader of the Wampanoags was denied the chance to give his speech where he actually describes accurately what happened to his people, and that was sort of too hot for the audience. But because he was shut down, it led to this National Day of Mourning protest, which is still ongoing every Thanksgiving, and in a strange way, the speech is more heard for having been undelivered.
Right. So let's get back to you for a second. Tell us how you got into the business of speech writing.
Yeah, so I started as the junior speechwriter, as I mentioned, for Al Gore. I think I got that job because I got the internship, and I think I got the internship because I wrote sort of a cheeky application essay. When I was very young, when I was 5, we got to go into the Oval Office. My great uncle had worked for President Carter, ironically as an inflation czar, so I don't know what that says, that anytime someone from my family is in the White House, it's not a good thing for inflation. But my sister, who I hope is watching, although maybe now I hope she isn't watching, my middle sister was 1 at the time, and she wet the rug in the Oval Office. So I write an essay basically saying very few people are lucky enough to get a chance to make a mark in the White House. I just want a chance to improve the one my sister already made. Gore's speechwriters see it and they think, okay, this guy seems like he has kind of the right sensibility. And that internship, I was on what we called how to hell duty. How to hell being like, how to hell did he know that? And I would go to the library or make phone calls and find out everywhere Al Gore was about to go and figure out what's the joke that we can make, what's the local community color that basically makes people say, how the hell did he know that? What was the football game that took place on Friday night between the town and the rival high school? What's the intersection where everyone's stuck in traffic so that when he shows up late, as he inevitably would, he can say, sorry I'm late, I got stuck at Malfunction Junction. And people would say, he gets us, he knows us, and maybe that buys him a little credibility to connect a little more with the audience. So this led to writing for Al Gore. At the time, the chief speechwriter, who became a wonderful mentor of mine named Bob Lehrman, was working on a textbook called The Political Speechwriter's Companion. So he had these binders that he was putting together a textbook of how to write speeches, and I became the guinea pig. So when I finished college, I was asked to come down and write for Gore, because there was an opening for someone who could subsist on ramen and work 18 hours a day, and then that was me. And that became the Gore connection. And this led to sort of being in and out of politics for many years. From Al Gore, I went to work for Tom Daschle, who we've mentioned here a little bit. For the Bostonians and New Englanders here, turning down a job with the New England Patriots. The person who took the job still brandishes 3 Super Bowl rings in my face. But I stayed in Washington, and I stayed in political speechwriting. So it was from Gore to Daschle, and then in and out, including helping oversee the speeches at the Democratic conventions, which I also describe as an opportunity to get yelled at, by 190 elected officials. That seems to be my job, just get yelled at by elected officials.
Right. So tell us how you connected with Biden.
Yeah, so Biden was really interesting. I was overseeing, helping to oversee, everything is is a communal effort, and I don't want to overstate my roles. But I was helping to oversee speeches at the 2008 Democratic Convention. And it was Senator Obama's convention, and his campaign hired me to write for whoever he chose to be VP. And so at that convention, I think I can share, I was tasked with writing 3 speeches, one for Evan Bayh of Indiana, one for Tim Kaine, who later became Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee, and one for Joe Biden. And even though I'd worked in the Senate for Tom Daschle, I didn't really know Joe Biden. And so we learned that Joe Biden is indeed the pick, and I get to meet him at the hotel as he rolls into Denver where the convention is. And he looked at me and said, "I've been in the Senate longer than you've been alive. What are you going to teach me?" And I think I probably didn't have a great answer. And so rather than write his convention speech, which I had almost 0 hand in, luckily he has had some truly wonderful writers working with him over the years, and still people like Mike Donnellan, Tony Blinken, before he was Secretary Blinken, was actually an extremely talented foreign policy speechwriter, and you see that in Tony's amazing speeches today. And I got to work with Beau, President Biden's now late son, and a guy who's just a prince of a guy. And what President Biden did was, while I was working with Beau on Beau's 6-minute introduction of Joe Biden, Senator Biden would often sit in the room with us, going through briefing books, but he would kind of half pay attention to the work Beau and I were doing together. And when Beau's speech became one of the powerful emotional moments of the convention, that allowed the father to say, "Okay, you can roll with me." And so we rolled out of Denver, and for 2 or 3 months straight, and my wife at the time was pregnant with our oldest daughter, so I abandoned a pregnant woman to travel with Joe Biden on the campaign. That kind of cemented the relationship, traveling every day.
Right, right. So let me ask you about the other party, the other side. Biden's opponent in 2020, Donald Trump, not a conventional orator, I think, but we were discussing this before. You think his speeches are effective for him. Why is that?
Yeah, so everyone asks me a Trump question and they expect me to say, like, isn't he bonkers? To which the answer is yes, but one of the intellectual exercises that someone put me through was, okay, draw a picture of a swamp. And everyone can draw like a frog and an alligator in a swamp. Now draw a picture of greater ethics and integrity in Washington. And no one can really draw a picture of that. And they say, now draw a picture of a wall. And you can draw a wall. They say, now draw a picture of enhanced humane border security. And no one can draw that. And these, more or less, were terms that Donald Trump was using and terms that Hillary Clinton was using.
Right.
And one of the things I say that was a strength of Donald Trump is that he spoke in very clear, approachable, understandable terms. And Democrats sometimes make the mistake, and President Biden's very good at avoiding this mistake, and I give him a lot of credit, but Democrats sometimes make the mistake of speaking in concepts, not concretes. And Donald Trump always spoke in concretes. The other thing I will say is, no one watching tonight, but the average American comprehends at somewhere around the 8th grade level. And Donald Trump's speaking, I read one analysis where it was at the 4th or 5th grade level. And which is not to say if you can read at the 8th grade level, you can't understand sophisticated concepts, but it doesn't always require sophisticated language to make those points. And so President Trump sort of intuitively got those 2 very important elements of communication. Now, I will also say when I arrived at the White House, I was given an office that had belonged to some of Donald Trump's speechwriters. And sometimes a speechwriter, looking at those speeches, sometimes a speechwriter tries to lead their boss and introduce new ideas. Sometimes a speechwriter tries to chase their boss and sound like them. And it was clear by that point in the administration, just from the speeches they left behind, the speechwriters were chasing their boss. They're basically like, he says this thing, so now I'm going to write this thing that sounds very similar to it.
Right, okay. So we're going to open up to questions shortly, but I'm going to sneak a couple more of mine in. And I'm wondering if were there any great white whales that you chased in working on this book? Undelivered speeches you thought might exist or may have heard rumors of that you just haven't been able to put your hands on yet?
Yeah, and I hope maybe the publication of the book will bring some of them out of the woodwork. I talk a little bit about following the breadcrumbs, and then sometimes the breadcrumbs lead to a brick wall.
Yep.
So, you know, I know, because I spoke to the person who wrote it, that President Carter had a speech prepared for the failure of the Camp David Accords. And the person who wrote it basically said, we were ready to lay the blame at the feet of the Israelis, actually. And when the deal finally came together, Carter had the draft failure speech on his desk, and we swept the whole everything on the desk into a box and headed to the White House lawn for the handshake. The box exists, by the way, but the speech wasn't in it. Condoleeza Rice's speech on September 11th, 2001 is still classified, and I was able to get pieces of it through a Freedom of Information Act request. But I'd love to see the whole thing, because one of the things that's very clear in the materials that were put together to prepare the speech was there's a technique in speech writing called refutation, where you basically raise each argument in favor of something and you refute it.
Right.
And she wanted to refute the arguments against missile defense. And it's funny to look at the materials that she was working off of, because the key spokesperson against missile defense was a senator who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee named Joe Biden. So one of the documents in the Rice dossier are like 12 arguments against Joe Biden. So it was very funny to see that Joe Biden was on the Bush administration's mind at the time. And I think part of why that speech remains classified. And this book is not political, right? This is a historical document. And a lot of these don't have much to do with politics. But that's the one chapter where I think the speech looks embarrassing for the speaker, only because there were lines like, you know, there's some people who think security means more metal detectors at the airports, you know, which didn't look good 8 hours later.
Yeah.
But again, it's not really to score points, but as a reminder that history can change in a moment. You know, the world can change in a moment. And I'd love to share that speech just because it shows how fast the world can change.
Right, right. So the greatest speech you've ever heard is what?
I need a better answer to this, but there is one that I love, which is, people who know speeches know it as the Vast Wasteland speech, which is Newton Minow, who was the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, basically, because I think great speech making is using the position you have to make the difference you can. And so yes, there are incredible fireside chats from FDR, wonderfully approachable. You know, some of Lincoln's speeches are the most important speeches, beautiful. But this I love because it's basically a guy saying to the broadcasters, start putting better stuff on TV or I'll shut you down. And he does it with humor and data and passion. And so in the grand scheme, it's sort of a small speech, and it changed the world only temporarily before cable unleashed a torrent of mediocrity on the world.
Right.
But I just love it for its humor. And by the way, a fun coda to that is his name was Newton Minow, M-I-N-O-W. Gilligan's Island, for those who watch Gilligan's Island, the boat is called the Minnow, not the M-I-N-N-O-W, but the M-I-N-O-W, kind of as a middle finger to Newton Minow, saying, you don't want crap on TV? Watch the crap we're about to make here.
All right, I get questions coming in now from viewers. So what do you believe are the basic elements of an effective political speech, whether or not it has ever been delivered?
I love this question because I have an answer. And
That's
this
kind of question.
This isn't my answer. This comes to show how analog this business is. This comes from a professor in the 1940s named Alan Monroe, and it's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence. And this is my cure-all for writer's block too. So for those of you who are looking for like some news you can use, basically every persuasive speech has 5 elements.
Okay.
Attention, problem, solution, visualization, call to action. Attention. This is why we love TED Talks, right? They immediately begin with a bold or counterintuitive claim or a joke or a story. They grab your attention right off the bat. Some studies show that, you know, when you're reading the internet, they have like less than 8 seconds to capture your attention.
Right.
And this is why I always say speeches should not begin with the acknowledgments. And here I will pause to say, thank you to the Kennedy Library for having us. Thank you for everyone who organized it. Thank you all for being here. But if you start with the acknowledgments, you lose the audience. So as grateful as I am, I will now acknowledge everyone who's here and who's made this possible. Then your second step is problem. And we forget, because smart people are always excited about the solutions, that you have to ground the solution in a problem. You have to make it meaningful to the audience. Then you can present your solution. But to show you can solve a problem is really an intellectual exercise. And this is a step people often forget, which is it's not enough to show you can solve a problem. You need to show what the world looks like when you solve that problem. And this is people in the tech business who release products say benefits, not features.
Right.
What's the benefit of this solution? Not what are the mechanics, but what's the benefit? And if you present that vision and get people to warm to the vision, the fifth step is call them to action, get them to do something about it. So if I ever have writer's block, I basically write down Roman numerals 1 through 5. How am I going to get attention? What's the problem? What's the solution? What does the world look like when the solution's put in place? And what do I need this audience to do? And if I can start writing something for each of those, I've kind of broken through the writer's block.
Terrific. So another question from the audience. What advice would you give a young person who might try to pursue speech writing as a career? This, other than go to engineering school instead.
Right, yes, right, there is that. I basically say, write for whoever will let you write. I think one of the things that broke things open for me was that I had written opinion columns for the college newspaper. And I was doing this at a time where there wasn't Twitter or blogs or, there weren't a lot of forums. So I wrote for whoever would let me write. I wrote for the college yearbook. No one writes for the yearbook. I wrote for the local arts rag in Providence, Rhode Island, the beloved Phoenix. I love that. I love the Phoenix publications. But I wrote for whoever would let me write, and it was on the strength of showing that I could condense an argument to 800 words, 850 words, that I think I got the opportunity. The other thing I say to young people a lot, and it's kind of in line with the James Carville anti-idealistic advice, is no one wakes up and says, how are they going to make your dreams come true? In this world, in this moment, there are a lot of organizations and leaders who wake up saying, how am I going to fight today? Mm-hmm. What's going to solve my problems? And I think a lot of young people, and I got this, so I was a partner in a company that I still have a relationship with that did a lot of speeches and communications consulting. And I always appreciated the letters, the cover letters, that did a little research and said, it looks to me like you are trying to do X and Y and Z. Here's how I can help you do that. Because being a talented person is kind of table stakes. What a lot of organizations and leaders really wanted to see is, can this person advance our agenda and kind of make my life easier?
Right.
So I think to the extent young people can show that they can write and have examples of that, and start looking for the job by behaving like a speechwriter, basically saying, I understand what you were going to say. Or I have or humbly, I think you might be trying to do this, and this is exciting to me for the following reasons.
Right, terrific. Do you know of speeches that you feel they're more powerful when read rather than spoken? Is there such a speech? More powerful read than spoken, as opposed to the other way around. Correct.
So, yes, and I point to a lot of George W. Bush speeches. Mm-hmm. If you were to look at his speeches on paper, I would argue those are some of the most beautiful, powerful speeches. The problem was when he read them, it was kind of like a guy walking a tightrope. Like, is he going to get to the end of this sentence? And you sort of hold your breath, and he did. And so those speeches were weakened by the fact that they were closer to the Platonic ideal of a speech than they were to being authentic to the guy doing the speaking.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of the conundrum for a speechwriter. Are you writing the Platonic ideal of a speech, trying to fill an empty vessel?
Right.
Or are you trying to write the speech that allows the speaker to be the best version of themselves? And so the ones that look best on paper are the ones that are kind of right to the Platonic ideal, but kind of fall a little flatter in delivery.
So if you had Abraham Lincoln that you could give it to, then this thing might really soar.
Right.
But if you have somebody of lesser skill, right, not everyone's a great orator, then it may not lift because it's not really of them.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the things that allows me to be a little less cynical about politics is we ask our political leaders to be excellent at everything.
Yep.
And it's really hard to be excellent at everything. They have to be funny, they have to be approachable, but they also have to be leaders, but they also have to be almost parental, and they also have to be really good at raising money, and they also have to understand foreign policy,
Right.
and this, and that, and the next. And it's really hard to be good at all of those things. And I think we would benefit from a little more recognition that when people are doing things for the right reasons, they're not always going to be great at everything. You know, there's an argument Lincoln couldn't get elected today.
Right.
And think of how much America would have suffered for that. And so I still maintain some idealism just because I do see, and I had a chance to work with a lot of people who were doing everything pretty well, but most importantly, doing it for the right reasons.
Right. So we have a question from a viewer. Is the role of the speechwriter always to amplify the vision of the principal speaker, or are there opportunities to directly shape the message? Is there a balance in there for you?
Yeah, one of the things I sometimes say is it would be shocking if it weren't, or be funny if it weren't shocking. Well, maybe I don't always say it because I can't remember how I say it. But basically, it's surprising how much policy gets made over the shoulder of the speechwriter in response to the question, can we say it this way?
Yeah.
Because the speech often becomes the clearest articulation of a leader's goals or mission or intent or policies, there is that moment of creation where just in trying to get it written correctly, the speechwriter says, so is what we're really saying this? And the answer helps shape the policy. So, and again, this depends on who the writer is. Some writers really are thought partners and policymakers. We're here at the Kennedy Library, where Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had some of the greatest policy advisors who were also poets. Dick Goodwin, Ted Sorensen. These are people who had the standing to advise on policy and to put the words to those policies. Now that has changed a little bit over time. Some presidents have had speechwriters who aren't really thought partners. We often say Nixon had some of the most talented speechwriters in the world, William Safire and others, but he sort of exiled them across the street to what's now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, and so they were at arm's length. Even Peggy Noonan, who wrote some of the most beautiful speeches for President Reagan, recounts in What I Saw at the Revolution that she barely met the guy. So, so the relationship changes and the relationship's different, and some writers, because of their standing with the leader, do shape policy a little more. Some articulate policy.
It's funny because I think this sort of echoes off bounces a bit off of another question we just got in, that Ted Sorensen said, quote, "Kennedy knew I looked at the world and saw it through his eyes," unquote. Can you speak to that statement?
Yeah, there's an element of speechwriting where you are a method actor. Mm-hmm. You are trying to play the part. I'll need some time to get some voices out of my head, but whenever I'm writing for someone, I really try to hear their voice in my head. One thing private sector clients often would ask me is, well, how do you make it sound like me? And obviously through YouTube and interviews and transcripts, you can hear someone enough to kind of get a sense of what words they use and what cadence is. But that doesn't necessarily sound like them. What sounds like someone is if it thinks like someone. So when I work with someone, I spend a lot of time trying to understand how they make an argument and how they see the world, which that quote gets to. And what I found is that as important as the words are, they are almost secondary, because if it thinks like me, it sounds like me.
Right. Can you know if a speech is great on paper, or does it have to be voiced into the air?
So this is a great question, because I was helping work on the 2004 Democratic National Convention, and at one point I looked at the speech that the young keynote speaker, Barack Obama, was to give.
Right.
And I looked at it on paper.
This is the famous red state, blue state speech, right?
And so I was sort of looking, I was like, red state, blue state, United State, it's kind of, that's like, it has a good ring to it, like, it's fine. And I looked at that speech and said, it's fine. And then someone came running in from the rehearsal room and said, this is going to be electric. And so on paper, I hadn't adequately sensed what the energy would be,
right,
and how it would land. And in the room, it was, I almost feel bad for John Edwards and John Kerry. Like, it was by far the most electric moment of the convention.
Right. Right. And is that from because of Obama's skill as an orator with the words? What part of that is what he wrote, and what part of that is just his natural ability and skill?
I think the cadences, his natural skill, and it met the moment, right? There's, part of the speech is the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that audience was looking for something like that message. I mean,
Right.
there's an argument that we're not red states, we're not blue states, we're the United States. Like, that might be received differently today.
Right.
But in the moment, it was this unifying message that people so wanted to grasp.
Now, on the flip side of this question, do you know of a speech that you thought was just going to slay, but it just, when you read it, but then when it was delivered, it just kind of laid there? It didn't really work.
Yeah, I'm sure I can think of some, but it absolutely happens. And
What do you take from that as a speechwriter? Do you say, wow, my boss really stunk it up with that one, my beautiful
Yeah.
words? Or do you think, like, I didn't.
Well, certainly I put it on me, and like I'll sit there, and a speech is not going well, right? Like I just start sweating, flop sweat by proxy is kind of an occupational hazard. It's hard to predict, or you think a laugh line is going to land or an applause line, and it just doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it comes down to, did I get the sheet music right? Like the words looked good as an essay, but did I misread what they would sound like as music?
Right.
And one of the things I advise people who write speeches is read it out loud first. Really do read it out loud. You'll find words that you don't need. You'll find places where you're boring yourself. And if you're boring yourself, you're going to bore the audience.
Right.
So practice matters, and a lot of people don't give themselves time to practice. A lot of people say, look, I'm better off the cuff. And almost universally, that is not true.
Right.
I think you honor the audience by taking the time to actually think about what you're going to say.
Right. All right. Well, in the short amount of time we have left, the greatest speech in American history is what?
Oh boy. Lincoln's second inaugural. But I haven't committed enough of it to memory to say why, but it's about, it's about, binding up our wounds, bringing us together. It's about what America can be. I mean, one of the things President Obama said to a writer of his named David Litt is, what's this speech about? Litt recounts the story, and Litt answers whatever that speech was about. And Obama says, no, it's about America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the best speeches are the ones that tell us, here's who we are, and here's who we can be.
Right.
And that is kind of the pinnacle of the form.
Yeah. What's next for you? You've got this book. What are you doing next?
Yeah, I've got this book. You have a book. Wait, can I turn the tables just for a second? Because you have a book out right now. So I'm now going to turn the tables because I'm excited for your book as well. So I'll ask you to please share something about your book.
Sure. It's The Imposter's War. It's the historical biography of a guy named John R. Ratham. He was an Australian immigrant to America. Came in around the turn of the 20th century. He was a liar, a cheat, a con man, an extortionist, a grifter, an imposter with a fake name and fake biography, and he became the most influential journalist of his generation.
Yeah, and the book is called?
The Imposter's War.
The Imposter's War. So we should say to the audience, so we're encouraging you to buy my book, but I want you to encourage both, and we'll know if you've done it because on Amazon it will say frequently bought together. so this is a chance for us to optimize for that. So I am touring behind the book. If you go to jeffreynussbaum.com, you can see I'll be in Cleveland and St. Louis and San Francisco. And I love forums like this. I love answering questions. So I will do that. I do have a relationship with the firm where I was a partner called West Wing Writers, so I'll conduct some business. But I am going to try to do something I have not done in a couple decades, which is actually take a summer off and spend time with my amazing and neglected daughters, Ada and Sophia, who may or may not be watching right now, and then I'll take it from there.
That's terrific. Well, Jeff, thank you very much for being here. It's been, it was fun, really fun for me, and I'm glad we had a chance to do this.
Oh, well, this is super fun, and thanks to the Kennedy Library and everyone watching.
Yeah, thanks for everyone watching. We really appreciate you tuning in for us, and have a great night.